The February cold in the parking garage hit different at 64. It gets into your joints, settles into your knees, reminds you that you are not the woman you were at 40. I had just visited my friend Ruth on the 3rd floor of Street. Catherine's medical center. She'd had her knee replaced and was doing beautifully, and I was walking back to my car, pulling my coat tighter, watching my breath turn to mist in the fluorescent light, when I heard it. A sound somewhere between a groan and a cough, low and wet, coming from behind the concrete pillar near the stairwell door. I am a retired hospice nurse. I have heard that sound before. I know what it means when a body is failing. I found my nephew slumped against the base of that pillar, his back against the cold concrete, one knee bent at a wrong angle, his face a ruin of swelling and dried blood. His left eye was nearly shut. His bottom lip had split cleanly through. He was conscious, barely, his fingers still curled around his phone like he'd tried to call someone and hadn't been able to manage it. I dropped to my knees beside him and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was there, rapid, thready, but there. "Marcus," I said. "Marcus, it's Aunt Dorothy. I'm here. I've got you." His good eye found my face. Something shifted in it, relief or recognition, or both. He opened his mouth and I leaned in close because whatever he was about to say was going to cost him, and I didn't want a single word lost. "It was Connor," he whispered. His voice was barely sound at all, more air than anything. "Mr. Hargrove told him to," he said. He stopped, swallowed. The effort of it made him flinch. "He said people like me don't get to threaten the Hargroves." I called 911. I held his hand while I did it, and I did not let go until the paramedics pulled into the garage 7 minutes later and took over. I watched them load him onto the gurney, and I followed their vehicle to the emergency bay, and I sat in those plastic chairs for 3 hours while they ran their scans and set his broken ribs and determined that he had a concussion that could have been much, much worse. And while I sat there, I called my sister. Lorraine is 68 and has lived in the same house in Beaumont, Texas for 30 years. And she picked up on the second ring the way she always does, because Lorraine has never once in her adult life ignored a phone call from family. "It is one of the things I love most about her. It's Marcus," I said, before she could say anything past hello. "He's in the hospital. He's going to be okay." But Lorraine, it was the Hargroves. There was a pause. Not a long one. Maybe 3 seconds. "Tell me everything," she said. So I told her. The parking garage, the pillar, the way he looked when I found him, what he had whispered to me before the paramedics arrived. Connor Hargrove, his father, Elliot Hargrove. The words, "People like me don't get to threaten the Hargroves." Another pause. Longer this time. "Dorothy," my sister said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the way it does when she is choosing words the way you choose footing on ice. "Do you remember what Daddy used to say about the Hargroves?" I did. In a general way. Our father, James Earl Mabry, had worked as a night security guard at Hargrove Logistics for 11 years, from 1979 to 1990. He had talked about the family occasionally, never warmly, never at length. He'd had a particular way of going quiet when their name came up in conversation, a particular way of changing the subject that my sister and I had attributed to discretion, or perhaps to the specific loyalty that comes from working for someone a long time. Even someone you do not much like. "I remember," I said. "There's something I need to tell you," Lorraine said. "Something I should have told you years ago. When Daddy passed when I was going through his things in the storage unit, I found something. I didn't know what to do with it. I put it back and I didn't think about it because Marcus was 15 years old and the Hargroves were just a name to us, and it didn't seem urgent. It seemed like old history." Lorraine. "He kept records, Dorothy. All 11 years. He documented everything he saw on those night shifts. Deliveries that didn't match the manifests. Men coming in and out at 2 in the morning with no paperwork. A fire in the East Warehouse in 1984 that everybody called an accident and Daddy never believed was. He wrote it all down in composition notebooks, date by date, and then he made copies, I don't know how. This was 1,990, and he put the notebooks in a waterproof lockbox, and he put that lockbox behind a false panel in the back of his storage unit. I sat in those plastic emergency room chairs and I did not say anything for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally asked. "Because I was scared," she said simply. "Because I read a few pages and then I stopped reading and I thought, these are powerful people. These are people with lawyers and money and connections. And Daddy was already gone and Marcus was a boy, and I thought, let it stay buried. Let it be someone else's problem." "It's our problem now," I said. Marcus had been dating Elise Hargrove for 14 months. He was 28, a logistics analyst, irony of ironies, working for a competitor of Hargroves' company, and he had met Elise at a mutual friend's birthday party in Houston. She was funny and warm and completely different from the image you might construct in your head of a shipping magnate's daughter. She wore her hair in natural twists and volunteered at a literacy program on weekends, and had told Marcus, apparently within the first month of their relationship, that her family's money had always made her deeply uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully explain. I had met her twice. I had liked her both times. I had thought, privately, that Marcus had found something real. Elliot Hargrove had not agreed. From what Marcus had told me over the months, his girlfriend's father had made his feelings known through the particular brand of polite devastation that wealthy men of a certain generation have perfected: the offhand comments, the pointed silences at family dinners, the way he would address questions to Elise as if Marcus were not in the room. Elise had pushed back. Elliot Hargrove had then become less polite. 3 weeks before I found my nephew in that parking garage, Marcus had discovered, in the course of his legitimate work, a pattern in freight billing records that connected to Hargrove Logistics. He had done what an honest young man with a conscience does. He had talked to his supervisor, who had passed it up the chain, and it had ended up with a compliance attorney who had sent a quiet letter. The letter, apparently, had reached Elliot Hargrove, and Elliot Hargrove had sent his son Connor. That was what I pieced together over the following days, sitting beside Marcus's hospital bed while his ribs healed and his eye opened back up and his voice came back to him. He had been in that parking garage because Elise had asked him to meet her there, a message from her number, as it turned out, sent from her phone, but not by her. Someone had borrowed her phone at dinner without her knowledge. Connor Hargrove, her older brother, who had smiled at Marcus across dinner tables and gripped his hand in what passed for a friendly handshake, had lured him to a concrete stairwell and made sure he understood the cost of threatening a family like theirs. My nephew is not a small man. Connor had brought 2 others with him. On the 4th day, I drove to Beaumont. Lorraine's house smelled like coffee and the gardenia candles she's been burning since 1998, and underneath that, the particular smell of old paper. She had already retrieved the lockbox from the storage unit before I arrived. It was sitting on her kitchen table, a gray metal strongbox, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, with a combination lock that our father had set to my parents' anniversary, 0922. September 22nd. Their wedding date. We opened it together. We did not speak while we did it. The composition notebooks were inside, wrapped in a plastic bag that had kept them remarkably preserved. 11 of them. Our father's handwriting, which I had not seen in 20 years, filled every page in his careful, deliberate way he had always printed, rather than writing in cursive, had always taken great pains to be legible, even in grocery lists, even in birthday cards. Dates along the left margin. Times. Descriptions. I read for 2 hours before I fully understood what we were holding. James Earl Mabry had been a quiet man, a church-going man, a man who believed that God kept accounts even when no one else was looking, and who had apparently decided that if God was keeping accounts, there was no harm in a night security guard keeping them too. He had witnessed 11 years of Hargrove Logistics using its shipping network to move things that had nothing to do with freight, falsified manifests, double-set books, payments to officials whose names he recorded carefully, an arson that had been staged to collect on an insurance policy worth 4 times the warehouse's assessed value. He had written down license plate numbers. He had written down names. He had, at some point in the mid-1980s, managed to obtain photocopies of several internal documents. I still do not know exactly how, and those were folded neatly inside the back cover of the 7th notebook. He had never gone to anyone with this. I think I understand why. He had a family. He had 2 daughters and a mortgage, and he knew, with the certainty of a black man in Texas in the 1980s, exactly how much protection the law was likely to offer him if he walked into a government office and accused a wealthy white family of federal crimes. So he had documented everything, locked it away, and trusted that someday it would matter to someone. It mattered now. I called a lawyer. Not the kind you find in a phone book. I called my college friend Patricia, who had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor before going into private practice, and I told her everything. She asked me to bring the notebooks to her office in Houston the following morning, and when I arrived with Lorraine and we laid them on her conference table, Patricia put on her reading glasses and did not say a word for 45 minutes. "These are serious," she said, when she finally looked up. "Some of this has run past any statute of limitations, but not all of it. And the insurance fraud from 1,984 combined with what your nephew found in those billing records, that's a thread that connects to things that are very much still active." She looked at me over her glasses. "You understand what you're setting in motion if we go forward with this?" "My nephew is in the hospital," I said. "His ribs are broken. His eye took 2 weeks to fully open. A man sent his son and 2 hired men to beat a 28-year-old in a parking garage because he was inconvenient. I understand exactly what I'm setting in motion." Patricia nodded once. "All right," she said. "Then let's do this correctly." She made calls that I was not privy to. I did not ask questions. I went back to Houston and I sat with Marcus, and I brought him soup from the Vietnamese place on Westheimer that he has loved since he was a teenager, and I told him what Lorraine and I had found. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "Grandpa James," he said finally. "Grandpa James," I confirmed. He never said a word. "He was protecting his family," I said, "the way he knew how, and now that documentation is protecting his." What came next did not happen quickly. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is a version of this kind of story where justice arrives like a thunderclap, dramatic and swift, and the truth is that it does not work that way. It works slowly. It works through subpoenas and depositions and meetings in lawyers' offices and evidence review and federal investigators who speak to you for hours and ask the same questions 12 different ways to make sure the answers are consistent. It works through weeks of waiting and then a phone call and then more waiting. The FBI became involved 6 weeks after I brought those notebooks to Patricia's office. I know this because 2 agents came to my house, not Marcus's apartment, my house, and sat at my kitchen table and asked me about my father's employment history and how I had come to find the lockbox and what I knew about Marcus's work and about his relationship with Elise Hargrove. I answered every question. I gave them the notebooks. I gave them the photocopied documents. I gave them everything we had, and I asked nothing in return except that they do their jobs. Elliot Hargrove was a careful man. He had spent decades being careful. He had lawyers whose only purpose was to insulate him from exactly this kind of exposure, and those lawyers were very good and very expensive, and I will not pretend that the outcome was ever guaranteed. Patricia was honest with me about that from the beginning. Careful men with good lawyers sometimes stay careful men with good lawyers. The scales tip or they don't, and all you can do is put your weight on the right side and hope. What changed things, what I believe truly changed things, was Elise. I had thought about her often through all of this. I had not reached out to her directly. Patricia had advised against it, and I understood the wisdom of that, even when it troubled me. She was not responsible for her family. She was not Connor, who had stood in a parking garage and broken my nephew's ribs. She was the woman my nephew loved, and she was in the middle of something that had been set in motion long before either of them was born. She reached out to me. 5 months after Marcus came home from the hospital, she called my cell phone. I don't know how she got the number, maybe from Marcus, maybe from someone else, and she asked if she could meet with me alone. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown Houston on a Thursday morning. She arrived before I did, which I respected. She was sitting with both hands wrapped around a mug, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well, which I also understood. "I need you to know that I didn't know," she said, before I had even fully sat down. "I know you didn't know," I said. When the agents came to the house, she stopped, collected herself. I grew up in that house. I went to school and came home and ate dinner at that table, and I thought I knew what my family was. I thought I knew what my father was. She looked at me directly. He sat at that table and talked about Marcus like Marcus was nothing, like he was a problem to be handled. And then when I found out what Connor had done, "You don't have to explain yourself to me," I said. "I gave them everything," she said. "The agents. I had been keeping records of my own. I didn't even know why I was doing it, exactly. I think somewhere I knew something was wrong and I didn't want to be the only one who couldn't prove it. Emails. Conversations I'd overheard. A meeting I walked in on by accident 3 years ago that my father told me I'd misunderstood. She shook her head. I gave them all of it. I looked at this young woman across a small coffee shop table, and I thought about my father, alone on his night shifts with his composition notebook and his careful handwriting, documenting things he was afraid to speak aloud because the cost of speaking them was too high. I thought about the 30 years those notebooks spent behind a false panel in a storage unit. I thought about my sister's voice on the phone, saying I was scared. "Your father's going to say you're a traitor," I told her. Not unkindly. She deserved the truth. "I know," she said. "It's going to be hard." I know that too. She and Marcus had not spoken in the months since his hospitalization. He had needed to heal. She had needed to figure out where she stood with her family, and the gap between them had grown with each passing week in the way that gaps do when there is pain on both sides and no clear bridge. I did not tell her what to do about that. That was between the two of them and had nothing to do with me. The indictment came down on a Tuesday in November, almost exactly 9 months after I found my nephew in that parking garage. Elliot Hargrove was charged on 7 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and obstruction of justice. Connor Hargrove was charged separately on 3 counts, including aggravated assault and criminal conspiracy. The 2 men who had been in that garage with him were charged as well. Patricia called me from her car, driving back from the courthouse. She was not the kind of person who gloated. She simply said, "It held up," in the tone of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that holding up is not guaranteed and should therefore not be taken for granted. "Your father's records were corroborated 6 different ways. They're going to trial." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my living room for a long time without turning on the television or making any calls. I thought about my father, James Earl Mabry, who had gone to work every night in a building owned by people who would have never looked him in the eye, and who had carried his silence home like a second job for 11 years, and who had died at 73 without ever speaking a word of it to his family. He had not known that his grandson would one day work in an industry connected to the Hargroves. He had not known that his documentation would sit in a storage unit for 30 years before it was needed. He had simply done what a man with his sense of duty could not avoid doing. He had written it down because it was true, and he had kept it because the truth seemed like it ought to be kept. I drove to Beaumont that weekend. Lorraine made her chicken and rice, and we sat at her kitchen table the way we had sat together for 60-some years, and we did not talk about the indictment or the lawyers or the notebooks. We talked about our father, the way he smelled like ivory soap and machine oil, the way he'd had a particular whistle he did when he was happy, 2 notes, always the same 2 notes. The way he'd taught us to play dominoes on this very table when we were girls, with the patience of someone who understood that some things take time to learn. Lorraine refilled my coffee without being asked, the way she's done my entire life, and for a while we just sat there in the comfortable silence of 2 old women who have known each other long enough that silence is a form of conversation. "He knew," Lorraine said eventually. "Didn't he? He knew it would come out eventually." "I think so," I said. "I think that's why he kept it." "He kept it for Marcus," she said. "He kept it for whoever needed it," I said. "He just didn't know who that was going to be yet." The trial took 14 months. It was not dramatic the way courtrooms are in movies. It was long and procedural, and involved a great deal of testimony about freight manifests and insurance adjusters, and the specific wording of documents signed in 1984. Marcus testified. I testified. Elise testified, which took more courage than most people are capable of, and she did it without flinching, in a navy blue suit with her hands very still in her lap, and answered every question her father's lawyers threw at her in a clear, steady voice. Elliot Hargrove was convicted on 5 of the 7 counts. Connor was convicted on all 3. The sentencing came on a Thursday afternoon in March, and I watched from the gallery as the judge read the terms 8 years for Elliot, 4 for Connor, and I kept my face very still, because I am a woman who understands that this is not a moment for satisfaction but for gravity. Afterward, in the parking lot outside the courthouse, Marcus found me and put his arms around me in the way he has since he was a little boy. this man who is now 6 feet tall, putting his head down on the shoulder of his short aunt, and he didn't say anything for a while, and neither did I. "I keep thinking about Grandpa James," he said finally, "just writing it all down, night after night, never knowing." "He knew something," I said. "He might not have known what, but he knew something. Did you ever wonder why? Why he didn't just let it go?" I had thought about that question many times in the past 14 months. I had thought about it in courtrooms, and in Patricia's conference room, and in Lorraine's kitchen, and in the quiet of my own house in the small hours of the morning. "Because letting it go would have meant it wasn't true," I said. "And your grandfather was not the kind of man who could make himself believe something wasn't true just because believing it was dangerous." Marcus nodded against my shoulder. The afternoon light was doing what Texas afternoon light does in March, that particular warm gold that lasts about 40 minutes before the temperature drops, and we stood there in the parking lot of the federal courthouse and let it rest on us for a moment before we walked back to our cars. I have been asked, since then, by people who heard about the case, what I would say to other women in situations like mine. Situations where the wrong is enormous, and the people who committed it have every resource and every advantage, and you have nothing except what you know to be true. I tell them what I have come to believe, that documentation is not nothing, that the record a person keeps, however quietly, however privately, however far from any official channel, that record is not nothing. My father knew he could not walk into a government building in 1984 and expect to be heard. But he could keep a composition notebook, he could make copies, he could put them in a lockbox with a combination set to the date he had promised to love someone for the rest of his life. He understood something that I think a lot of people miss, that power is very confident, and confidence makes people careless about time. The Hargroves had been powerful for so long that they had stopped being afraid. They had stopped imagining that the people they had used and dismissed and hurt might have kept records, that the children of those people might still be out there, that 11 notebooks in a storage unit might outlast their certainty. Truth is patient in a way that power never is. That is the whole of it, really. That is everything I know.